Hey YouTube, welcome back. mDecks Music here. We're going to continue our series on how to write music using mapping Tonal Harmony Pro, decoding Beethoven. As we said before, we're going to get into theme B. We're going to skip the transition, go back to that later, you'll see why. But before we do so, we're going to have to talk about a few things. We're going to have like a three-pronged approach to this part of the video where we talk about first Beethoven's grammar or his language or how he writes stuff. We're going to then compare and contrast elements of theme A that we're more familiar with to elements of theme B. And then we're just going to do an analysis of theme B. So let's get started into how Beethoven talks, what his grammar is, and how he writes. Okay, so Beethoven's grammar. On screen we have a little illustration here we're going to refer to as the Trinity because it's made up of three components. What we have here is the idea, the repetition of that idea, and then a variation. So within this piece and a lot of Beethoven's catalog, you're going to see this sort of writing. One of the things that's really great about this piece of writing, or this way of writing I should say, is that it naturally creates these balanced, valid musical statements. So let's get first into what is an idea, what is a repetition, what is a variation, and then we can illustrate how this trinity or this ternary form of writing naturally creates balanced music. So an idea, we'll keep it real simple. An idea can be something as reductive as this. And then I can play it again. It's rhythmically very consistent with the first idea. It's actually melodically the same thing, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be, but for the sake of exemplifying what we're talking about here, I'm just going idea, repetition, and then the variation can be, all right, the connecting link between the variation and the first idea and the repetition is that A flat, that first note, all right? So I have idea, repetition, variation, really simple, and then I can harmonize that however I want based on what the melody is saying. So it's probably also worth noting that the variation should have some sort of conclusion to it, some sense of release or resolution. I achieve that very simply by just doing an authentic cadence, by going 1, 5, 1. That's not the only way to do it. This idea of what is conclusion, what is release is sort of subjective. You're going to have one person say, oh, that's really conclusive. And another person might be like, I don't know if that's the right way to end that. But rather than show you, hey, you have to do it like this, we'll just speak in these somewhat vague terms of it should have an idea of release. It should make you feel like, oh, this statement is over. And there's a myriad of different ways to do that. Like I said, you can play it safe and just use a predetermined path like an authentic cadence. Or you can come up with your own way of doing it. The point being that that variation wraps everything up into a nice, neat box where you have this, this, and then you move on and do something else. So let's speak to maybe how this trinity or this ternary form of writing creates, naturally, balance within the piece. So if I were to do something like I don't know, like this. So that example really doesn't kind of illustrate any sort of balance or cohesiveness. Like any one of those ideas could have worked on its own and then could have been expanded on if I so choose. But them all being consecutively played back to back led to no sense of unity. Very disparate these ideas were because they had nothing to do with one another rhythmically or melodically. They were in different keys. So like I said, any one of them could have worked as an idea that we could have expanded on, but to kind of play them back to back to back to back doesn't really lead to a cohesive, succinct, direct theme or idea. So in this ternary form or this trinity that we're using, it naturally creates that because you have this idea and you have something in the repetition that reflects similarly rhythmically or melodically that idea, and then again in the variation. And you see it throughout not only this piece, like we said before, but a lot of Beethoven's catalog. All right, so something else that's really cool to this piece and a lot of Beethoven's other music is this fractal sort of effect that you have when you take a look at the piece either really close up or when you step away from it. You start to see like these similar shapes inside of similar shapes inside of similar shapes as he's writing. Sort of like a Russian nesting doll sort of effect, where you have the same thing inside of the same thing inside of the same thing. So let's illustrate this in a way that sort of makes sense, using the piece we wrote just a second ago, this whole, you know. So that in and of itself could work as a theme. But what we're gonna do is like sort of step back from the picture a little bit and make it the idea of an even larger theme. So we can do that by just taking that same sort of idea rhythmically, melodically, and moving it up. All right? So now I have this. I have an idea, what was previously our whole theme, an idea, and then I do this. So elements of the idea, the same rhythm, the same sort of movement, sort of a sequence, and then I can just variate it, have a conclusive sort of definitive ending by going. So with this like sort of like macro perspective of stepping back to our newly kind of evolved version of the original piece, we see elements of the idea in the repetition and also within the variation. And it doesn't even really have to be like that complicated. Like our repetition could have been a literal repetition of the first idea. We could have gone, you know, we could have said the same thing 2 times in a row, which Beethoven actually does in theme B, which we'll see later on. So in theme A, his repetition is sort of a sequence of the original idea. He takes the 1 chord and then moves over to the 5 chord. And in theme B, we're going to see how he basically literally says the same thing 2 times in a row as the idea and the repetition, which is then followed up by his variation. So why don't we play for you guys like both theme A and theme B so you can hear what we're talking about. Like, so in theme A, you're going to hear this sequence of the idea, like not a literal repetition of the idea, but something that has the same shape and the same rhythm and lands on the same strong beats, and we'll sort of like compare and contrast that to theme B. So here's theme A. So there's theme A. You can clearly hear a very straightforward and concise idea, a sequenced repetition of that idea, and a variation including all the elements of that idea and the repetition. Now theme B has a slightly different approach to the repetition. You're going to hear a literal repetition. You're going to hear played twice, back to back, on top of also him treating the variation a little differently as far as how many measures are in this section compared to the first section. Just take a listen and see if you can hear what I'm talking about. So in both examples, you clearly hear this whole Trinity idea that we've been talking about, an idea, a repetition of said idea, and then a variation. And if you take a closer look within each one of these themes, or take a step back, I guess depending on your perspective, you're going to see these fractal elements that we were talking about, these similar shapes inside of similar shapes, this whole like Russian nesting doll approach to the writing. So whether this was conscious or not, we really don't know. All we know is it makes for really balanced, valid statements, and also it's a really cool effect when you know what you start to look for and you're like, oh, this little element is inside of this little element, which is the same as what it's in. It's really neat, and we're going to delve into it a little bit more as we do a more thorough analysis of B. So just be on the lookout for that sort of like shape inside of shape, fractal sort of effect that Beethoven uses in this piece and a lot of his other songs too. So next thing we're going to do is get into comparing and contrasting a little more thoroughly theme A with theme B, and then we're going to go into an all-out analysis of theme B. So hope you enjoyed everything. If you feel like it, click on that subscribe button. Keep your comments, questions, and suggestions coming. We really appreciate the feedback. Thanks for watching.